My name is Sanjeev. It's a pleasure to be making this presentation to you. I wish it was in person because every time I attend one of these conferences, I walk away extra energized due to your passion and your zeal for making improvements in organizations around the world. But we are where we are. Hopefully, next time we'll see each other. Many of you know me, and I know many of you. Some of you don't. So here's a quick introduction. I started my journey in TOC in 1990 after reading The Goal, working for Xerox, and I took a job in one of the factories to help turn it around using the ideas in The Goal. Since then, I have started two companies. The first company was focused on production scheduling. The second is on project scheduling. And we have had a lot of successes in delivering value to the customers, tremendous value. We have had a lot of disappointments. But today, what I'm going to talk about, which is the idea of flow-based scheduling, the purpose is not to teach you something new about flow-based scheduling. I think most of you already know much more than I can teach you or what I have practiced in the area of flow-based scheduling. The point that I'm going to make, though, is slightly different, which is if we want to take the ideas of the goal and spread them much more widely and actually bring them into practice, flow-based scheduling is the path we have to follow. Because if we look at the book, The Goal is a seminal book. There are three main ideas in the goal. One idea is the constraints. Find the constraints, remove the constraints, manage to the constraints, etc. The second idea is throughput accounting versus cost accounting. But there's a third idea, which is flow. And oftentimes, after you have read the goal, that idea that gets lost, the idea that stays is the idea of constraints, and the idea that gets lost is the idea of flow. And what do I mean by the idea of flow gets lost? So immediately after you read the book, The Goal, the first thought of managers is let's find the constraint, remove the constraint. And let's find the next constraint and remove it. And as you remove the constraints, our performance will improve. But it does not work like that. Until you have established flow, streamlined flow in the factory, removing constraints, identifying constraints will not work. In fact, you can't even identify the constraints because when you don't have flow, when you have piles of inventory everywhere, then it looks like the constraint is everywhere. The second way it hurts, this focus on constraints versus flow, is the other reaction of managers is that let's find the constraints and let's strip out all the excess capacity on the non-constraints, which ends up creating bottlenecks, more bottlenecks all around, which ends up actually hurting flow. And the goal and TOC are not alone. The same thing has happened to Lean. So there was a book called The Machine That Changed the World, which was published in 1990. It was about Toyota production system. The main message the market got out of it was eliminate waste. Let's find every waste in our process, remove the non-value added activities, remove the excess capacity, and forgetting that the main success of Toyota production system came from streamlining the flow through their factory using the Kanban system. And as a result, Lean is again practiced today, but in its worst form possible, not to establish flow, but to eliminate waste, which doesn't go anywhere. And even recently, Agile software development, the main idea behind Agile software development is to reduce the flow time between having an idea about a software requirement or getting a requirement from a customer and making sure the software fully developed, tested, is working with the customer. And the idea was do the development in small batches. But what people got out of it was let's develop software in short sprints, in 3-week sprints. Whether the feature will take 3 months to develop or 6 months to develop, the sprints are going to be 3 weeks long. At the end of the sprint is done, the features are not done, and they go into a backlog and sit there forever. Right? So the point here is that if we want to take the goal forward, the main ideas of the goal forward, we have to take the idea of flow forward. Another mistake we have made, in my mind, is that when we talk about the value of flow, we overemphasize the wrong parts. The part that gets emphasized is the impact of shorter lead times on market share in the case of new products, or unit prices of products in the case of new products. The idea being that if you are first to market, you can grab a high market share and you can demand a higher price from the market. Or if you are selling projects or making products in an industrial B2B environment, if you can convince the customer of the value of lead time, you can charge them a higher price. But it does not work like that. Most industries, most customers, most markets do not think that time is the primary factor. Of course, there are some industries, some market segments where time is the primary factor. And those industries have already learned how to operate in a fast cycle environment. But for most others, during sales, the main worry is about cost and quality. And salesperson will promise whatever lead time the customer demands, and when they don't deliver on time, they'll manage that in execution, right? So that is what happens from a marketing perspective. The impact of flow on market, I think, is overstated, and by overstating it, we have just hurt our cause. There is one segment where the value of flow is clearly understood, is immediate, is a high value, which is cash constrained operations. Ravi Gilani from India has done a lot of work in those kind of companies where the companies are growing very fast and cash becomes their constraint. So the value of faster flow is very obvious to the owner managers, not to professional managers, but to the owner managers, because they know the faster they can flow the goods, the faster the cash turns around, and then a compounding effect takes over in terms of cash and profits, and which is very, very lucrative. And similarly, if you have small, very small businesses, you're going to be always cash constrained. So the value of cash flow and flow is understood there too. But the place where the value of flow, I think, is underappreciated, and we have not done a good job of selling the value of flow, is the impact on operations. What do I mean by that? The typical experience in operations is that on projects, when I say operations, I mean supply chains, projects, hospitals, whatever operations there are. The typical experience is that if you want to get something done faster, you have to spend extra money. And this experience comes from the fact, from recognizing that there is other work going on in the factory or in projects. And when you want to expedite a specific project or a specific order or a specific patient, you have to disrupt the priorities everywhere else. You have to spend extra money in terms of expediting cost, and ultimately speed costs money. In projects, even PMI, a lot of people talk about the iron triangle in projects, which is, hey, if we can have cost, quality, and speed, but only two out of those three, not the third. So if you want to reduce cost and improve quality, you have to do things slower. If you want to increase the speed and increase quality, you have to spend more money, etc. And this is where flow comes in. Flow, I will define it very quickly, is very simply about systematically reducing the queues across the operation and making sure that work flows from beginning to end in a predictable manner. That is my simple definition of flow. So when you systematically reduce queues across the board, the speed that you get is for free. And you don't have to incur any more cost to get faster speed. And in fact, you can get speed. You can get your speed to the point where the customer is not only speed is not a determining factor, but the customer doesn't even care about anything much faster than that. Right? So speed is free, but it gets better than that, because queues, and this is the next two slides I'm going to talk about, they have been talked about in the book called The Race. Again, a great book by Dr. Goldratt and Bob Fox. If you have not read it, I would urge you to read it. And the point there is that when the queues come down, suddenly a lot of firefighting in operations comes down. Suddenly the opportunities for misallocation of resources, which is work is sitting in the queue and me working on the wrong priorities or using the materials for making the wrong products, suddenly those opportunities come down a lot. And also there is less rework because the quality problems are discovered faster, right? So with systemic reduction in queues, you actually not only get speed for free, but you get speed and lower costs and higher quality. And finally, When you reduce the queue systematically across the board, the other thing that happens is that the capacity of the organization becomes visible. I remember at Xerox, after I read the goal and I took a job in this factory to help turn it around, I was trying to find Herbie, the constraint, but there were piles of inventory everywhere. And I would talk to the operators, and what I would hear is everything is a bottleneck. Everywhere we were spending extra overtime at the end of the week to try to get back on track. And it was impossible to find a constraint because the capacity was not visible. In projects, that is often the case. Everyone is working extra hard, everyone is working long hours. So you think that there is capacity constraint everywhere. And if you want to increase the number of projects you can do, you have to increase capacity everywhere. But the reality is that as soon as you reduce the queues, you find number one, you have excess capacity in most places, actually in every place. And you also know one or two places where you might not have enough capacity. And that is the place where you go and spend money to increase capacity. Right? So this is the operational impact of improving flow. And I think it's a hidden gold mine. Flow is applicable to all operations. And when I say all operations, I don't mean dentist offices and medical offices where it's a single step process. I'm talking about factories, projects, hospitals, etc., where there are multi-step processes in terms of converting inputs into outputs. And you have multiple resources that have to accomplish that work. Right? So that is what I mean by complex operations. So every complex operation can benefit by improving flow. A second recognition for me, and this is what I want to impress upon you also, is to improve flow, to establish flow, to go from a high queue environment to a flowing environment. Yes, we have to maybe change a little bit of the expectations and measurements in the organization. Maybe we have to change a little bit of the mindset, but that is not the primary thing. The primary thing is you need to change their scheduling system, their scheduling process. By system, what I mean is not necessarily software, but the way they schedule their operation. That is what got to change. Right? And scheduling is often necessary to improve flow because there are only two ways to achieve flow, which is to reduce queues. Either you set up your assembly lines, production lines in a way where you minimize or where you control the amount of work that is there in front of every work center by limiting the space or by controlling the speed at which the lines are moving, or you have a scheduling system. Production lines are possible when you are making the same product day in and day out, because now you can actually set up a physical production line with resources, dedicate capacity to every step in the process. But if you have a high mix, then you cannot do that. Similarly, if your volumes are low, then production lines become less and less possible. If you are operating in a high volume environment, you can actually invest the kind of money that is needed to dedicate capacity to every workstation to build an assembly line. Dr. Goldratt has written about all these things in his paper on flow. Product life cycle, same story. If you are operating with shorter product life cycles, then you don't want to build an assembly line, a rigid assembly line, because whatever money you invest, you will not have enough time to amortize that investment over time. The product life cycles are short. As soon as the product becomes end of life, then you have to reconfigure the assembly lines. And finally, as work gets virtual, obviously you cannot rely on production lines. Virtual work cannot be controlled through production lines. It can be controlled only through scheduling. But this is the most important point in my presentation. I think where I have gone wrong, where we have gone wrong, is when we talk about the ideas in the goal, instead of just saying that this is the best idea, I think the point is much simpler. Flow-based scheduling is the only scheduling approach that can work when we are talking about operations with dependencies. Every other scheduling approach fails. It does not work. So I remember that this idea of factory scheduling and supply chain scheduling was becoming very popular in the 1990s. There was a company called I2 Technologies. They went from $4 million in revenues to $1 billion in revenues in 8 years. they actually use constraint-based optimization. They were known as the leaders in constraints-based optimization. They used to actually hand out the goal to every one of their prospects and their customers. But they did not adopt the ideas of flow from the goal. And the result was that the software was pretty unusable. And after 8 years, reality caught up with them and the company tanked. And the same thing has happened in many other arenas, especially project management. So why does traditional scheduling fail? We know the scheduling problem is complex. Just trying to fit all the different orders with different steps, different amounts of capacity, different amounts of workload that every order places is like a Tetris problem. So it's a complex problem. On top of that, we are not only trying to take care of resource utilization, we also want minimal lead times. We want high on-time delivery. We want to reduce our inventories, but keep our order fulfillment rates high. And the traditional approach is to tackle this complexity with complex algorithms, right? The more complex the algorithms are, the belief is that the better the schedules are. And of course, as the algorithms become more complex, you also need more data. And if you want your algorithms to do a good job, the data better be very good, high quality. Or in traditional world, high quality data means it better be precise, because if you want to really tightly pack this Tetris, you need to have good data about the Tetrises. And first of all, such scheduling systems are very difficult to implement. Getting all this data right, setting all the parameters right in your scheduling algorithms is impossible, nearly an impossible task. But even if these scheduling systems manage that feat of getting ready for use in the real world, as soon as the schedules are created, reality hits. So if you assume that this Tetris is going to take 5 days to finish, but it takes actually 5.05 days, like the entire schedule is gone for a toss, which means all the commitments you made to your customers, they are no longer relevant. They're no longer achievable. All the schedules you gave to the frontline people, they are pretty useless. And now if you have to reschedule, it's not done. You're not going to go and tell your customers, sorry, the date that we promised yesterday, we cannot meet that date anymore. And you're not going to jerk around the people on the front line, whether it's engineers or shop floor operators or other kinds of workers, in terms of their daily schedules. So what happens is these scheduling systems actually never get used. Even if they get implemented, they don't get used. And organizations typically revert back to their manual mode of scheduling, where everyone is just worried about scheduling what is in their queue. And all these schedules are disconnected on top of each other. And that is how organizations approach, which high queues, localized scheduling, a lot of firefighting, etc. Flow-based scheduling simplifies the whole scheduling process and actually makes it usable, the schedules usable. So the first thing in flow-based scheduling, which is unique in flow-based scheduling, is there are two different modes of scheduling. One is planning and one is execution. The purpose in planning is to make commitments, and the purpose in execution is to meet those commitments. And when you decompose the problem into these two sub-problems, that already starts making the scheduling process simple. But the next big simplification in flow-based scheduling comes from the fact that in flow-based scheduling, flow times are an input into the scheduling process, not an output of the scheduling process. Because once you buy into the idea of flow, you suddenly realize that majority of your flow time is comprised of queues, not the processing times. And these queues, whether they are on account of time buffers or non-instantaneous availability of resources, or stock buffers, which is when you need materials to make sure they are instantly available when the customer or the downstream supply chain wants them. The majority of the flow time is not based on processing time. It's based on these buffers. And these buffers, they don't vary order by order. These buffers are system-wide buffers. And these buffers, so you can start with flow time, given a flow time assumption before you begin the scheduling. As soon as you do that, suddenly the planning process becomes very simple. All you have to do is focus on finding capacity. Right? So you know when the order is due, you know how long it's going to take to complete the order from beginning to end. And now you just need to find the right capacity for this order. And if you have a conflict for capacity between two different projects or two different orders, those are the only two orders or projects that need to be prioritized relative to each other. You don't need to have a sophisticated priority system for every project in the system. Right? So this is the first simplification that happens. The second simplification, because still the Tetris problem still remains. This finding capacity for all the orders, that is still like a Tetris problem. Where flow-based scheduling makes it simple is recognizing that the queues that you have in the system, they cannot be predicted where exactly the queues will occur. You can estimate how much the total queue time would be, but where exactly the queues happen, you cannot predict it. As soon as you recognize that, you realize that you don't need precise schedules for every work center, every resource in the system. And now you can find some simple way of level loading capacity, whether it's by finding the most loaded resource, or in case of job shops in projects and projects, we don't even look at resources to begin with. We just look at the total number of projects or the total number of orders that are in the shop. And we just say, we're going to work with, if today we have 10,000 orders in the shop, tomorrow we're going to have only 5,000 orders in the shop at any given time. And so we just do that simple loading, level loading, and that is sufficient. And once you get into execution, so you have figured out when you are going to start the work, you know what the due dates are. In execution, all you need to do is now prioritize the work that is in the queue. So because the only problem that is remaining is that the resources need to know what they should work on next. And that problem is also very simple because you know when a specific order is due. So the only thing you need to find out is which order needs to be done so that it can meet its due date. And so this is the story for projects and production. Supply chains also become simple. Again, by recognizing that this instantaneous demand cannot be forecast. No, we can forecast and aggregate as to how much of an SKU we will consume in a month or maybe in a week. But knowing exactly which day what SKU will get sold in what location, that is impossible to forecast. And as soon as you recognize that, you realize that you cannot use forecast for day-to-day scheduling of the supply chain. So to tell the supply chain what to produce, you cannot use the forecast for that because you cannot forecast the instantaneous demand. So the only mechanism that is left for you is the well-known pull system, which is if your demand is constant, but with some statistical fluctuations, you implement a one out, one in rule. You sell one, you're going to order one throughout the supply chain. Or if your demand is going up, maybe you will say for every sale you make, you will order two pieces, or vice versa if the demand is going down, in case you have end-of-life products. Or if you have seasonality, same kind of a thing. Some modified pull signal is sufficient to generate the schedule for the entire supply chain. And of course, you still need forecasts, but the forecasts now are much simpler because the only reason you need now forecast is to decide how much total capacity to have or how much the buffer should be. Right? With that information, that being the only output of forecasts, the forecasts become much simpler. And so the point here is that in traditional scheduling is complex and unusable, whereas flow-based scheduling is certainly much simpler and is also usable. There is one trap, though, with flow-based scheduling that I have seen even the best of us fall in, the traps we fall into, which is sizing of the buffers. How much the buffer should be, we tend to sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot. In projects, I have seen it again and again, where the assumption that is made wrong is that buffers are there to protect us against Murphy. That is not true. Buffers are there because queues will happen in the system, because resources will not be available exactly when you need them. That is what determines the buffers. Of course, once you have a buffer in the system, you can also use it to absorb Murphy, because if there is some delay from the supply chain or somewhere, because there is a buffer and the work has to pass through the queues, so if there's a delay, all you do is you jump the queues. And that is how buffers are used to absorb Murphy. But buffers are not placed to absorb Murphy. Buffers are a necessity because of the non-instantaneous availability of resources. Second trap, that, hey, if the buffers are there because of these fluctuations, why can't we simulate? Why can't we figure out through simulations what the optimal size of the buffers is? And the problem there is, yeah, there are statistical fluctuations, but you don't know how much statistical fluctuation there is. Right? Simulators are awesome for proving that flow works. Simulators are also great sometimes for figuring out where is the best place in the supply chain to put the buffers, but not for sizing the buffers. For sizing the buffers, I go with Dr. Goldratt's maxim: just cut the current flow times by half. Whether it's production lead times, stock buffers, or projects, his recommendation was always cut them by half. In projects, actually, he did not say cut by half. He would say cut by 25%. I don't know why he went a little bit less aggressive in projects. But what we have found is 25% in multi-project environments, cutting the flow times by 25% is not enough. You have to cut it by 50%. And once you have cut those flow times, you can still do a common sense validation to make sure you're not shooting yourself in the foot by causing stock outs or by causing resource starvation. And those are very simple analysis that I will not talk about in this presentation, but most of you probably already know how to do that validation. And once you have established these buffers, you can start using flow-based schedules. And as you start using flow-based schedules, as you streamline the flow through your factory or through your projects or through your supply chain, now the data starts becoming useful. The data that you have about any kind of disruptions that happen, you can start using it to maybe refine the buffer sizes. Because you might find that you might have a little bit too much of buffer or a little bit too little of buffer. And I think this is an important point that the world is going to fall into this trap again. Every time there's a new IT revolution, the world thinks IT is the solution, and they go and invest tons of money in new IT. It happened with scheduling. Same thing is happening with artificial intelligence and regression analysis now. People think that, hey, we have all this data. If we can just put some machine learning on top of it, we'll find out how to optimize our operations. And the answer is, you will not. Until you have streamlined the flow, all the data that you have is the data about chaos. It doesn't tell you anything. So the point here is that flow-based scheduling is the only scheduling approach that works. Traditional scheduling approaches, no matter how much sophisticated you make them, first of all, they start at a high degree of sophistication. And even if you add more sophistication to it, doesn't make them useful. Whereas flow-based scheduling is useful at very high level of simplicity. And in fact, you cannot make it more sophisticated than a certain amount beyond a certain point. In fact, whenever I hear people describing their flow-based scheduling approach in terms of how much complexity it can handle, my antenna go up. I know most likely they've fallen into the trap of traditional scheduling. In projects, people say, hey, we can run critical chain on a project network of 20,000 tasks, 50,000 tasks. That is not the answer. Complexity doesn't work in the real world. For two reasons: complexity requires data, which is not available, and then there is variability that hits you and makes all those complex calculations, it renders them useless. So the flow-based scheduling algorithms are simpler, data requirements are minimal, and you can get good schedules even with imprecise data. And one example I want to point out here is what Alex Knight did. Alex Knight, he tackled the problem of flow-based scheduling in a very complex environment, emergency rooms of hospitals, where you don't have any data. You don't know what treatment the patients might need. You can't really predict what rate the patients will arrive at. So he was still able to implement flow-based scheduling in that kind of an environment. That is the power of flow-based scheduling. And it is really a disappointment for me that flow-based scheduling is not more widely adopted or used in organizations around the world. And that is the reason that this year, I have started this Institute for Flow-Based Scheduling, which is the purpose is to just increase the adoption of flow-based scheduling. And there are two main things we are going to do. A lot of knowledge is already out there. We want to just take that knowledge, compile it, and give it out for free to organizations that are interested in it. And the ideas are very simple. And with that education, we feel a lot of organizations can implement flow-based scheduling on their own. The second is research in some of the theoretical aspects of flow-based scheduling, which is proving why you need protective capacity, for example, as well as some new applications of flow-based scheduling for environments that are not captured by inventory management supply chain solution or by production or by projects. And towards that end, I'm actively recruiting some founding partners, one or two founding partners who have practical success in implementing flow-based scheduling and also maybe background in optimization theory and simulation. I want to thank you for listening to me. Again, as I said, nothing new, no new knowledge. The only point I'm trying to make is that if we want to spread the ideas of the goal forward, we have to rally around the idea of flow-based scheduling. That is powerful, valuable, and unique. Now, time for Q&A.